All right, Shalom. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahweh Shai, Bahashum, Rakha Kodash. I want to give double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well in grace and peace to you elect around the four winds, believing and pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. This is your fellow servant, Rakhaya from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another impromptu lesson. And the title of this lesson is Stop Looking for a Shortcut, Be Thorough in Your Building. All right. And tonight's lesson is inspired by a few things I was taking care of around the house. And in the midst of me doing some work around the house, a washer broke down on me. And as I went to go get my tools to fix it, I was taking it apart. And as I was taking it apart, I noticed that in the motherboard control box, the control system, the neutral and the hot leg were crossed. It ended up, the wires ended up being burnt up, and it was because the person that came and tried to fix it before me took a shortcut. Instead of doing thorough work, good, clean, thorough work, and they took a shortcut across the wires and ended up getting burnt, and it just made me think, meditate on us, as the Lord's men, as spiritual men. It's important that we don't take shortcuts concerning this truth of ours. It's important that we remain thorough in our building and enjoy the process that the Lord has us going through, the process of obtaining wisdom, the process of obtaining experience and faith. All right, it's a very thorough process that takes involvement and it takes temperance, which is something that the Lord is increasing within us every day. All right, which I want to get this in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter. And verse 25, it says, "And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible." And I actually want to grab that in the blue letter so I can get that word for temperate in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter. The shortcut always seems like the best option and the best route in the flesh, in the moment. But in terms of longevity, the shortcut never lasts. The shortcut always ends up worsening the situation, at the latter end. Rather, as if you would have took the thorough, enjoyed the process at the beginning and took the thorough route. At the end, you would have been able to enjoy the fruits of your labor. It's a lot like us spiritually. We see how a lot of guys who tried to take the shortcut to wisdom, tried to take the shortcut to leadership, and to knowledge, ultimately ended up burning out. Just like that motherboard. It ultimately ended up burning out because they didn't do a thorough work in their faith, in their building. There were holes in their faith, holes in their spirits that ultimately got exposed at the end. But we have examples, such as Yahweh Shai, and examples in the flesh, our elders and apostles, of men who took the thorough way of building, the temperate route of building, and increasing in the faith. And we see how the Lord has increased them throughout the years to the point to where they're at now, even within us, all right, even us ourselves, in a sense, are being built up as we remain temperate and bring our bodies under discipline and the subjection of the spirit of Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai. But this is 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 25. Again, it says, "And every man that striveth for the mastery," I'm going to start at verse 24. It says, "Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run that ye may obtain. And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible." And when you get that word for temperate, Strong's G 1467. And it says to exercise self-restraint. It says to contain, to be temperate, to be self-controlled, to exhibit self-government, to conduct oneself temperately. A figure drawn from athletes when preparing themselves for games, abstain from unwholesome food, wine, and sexual indulgence. All right, so it goes into self-discipline. And the scriptures say that those who strive for the mastery, which we all are striving for the mastery, okay, do so temperately, all right, with self-governance, with discipline, with restraint, with integrity, all right. And when it comes to this journey of ours, speaking for myself first and foremost, all right, this journey of ours takes temperance, it takes integrity, all right, it takes self-discipline, all right, to take the thorough route to begin with, so that the latter end is better than as at the first. Because if you take the shortcut at the beginning, the latter end is going to be worse than at the first. If all roads lead to the same place, why take the shortcut? Why not enjoy the process so that the end will be that much more beautiful? Even in that, the scriptures speak about how the servant is no greater than his Lord. If Yahweh Shai had to go through the process, what makes you think that we can take a shortcut? It doesn't work like that. All right, we have to take on our yoke, the yoke of Yahweh Shai, and we have to go through our own prospective trials so that the Lord can build us up the proper way. All right, so that, in a time of trouble, in a time where our faith is tested, there had been a thorough work on our spirit. There is no holes to expose. There is no cross wires. There is no T's that are I's that aren't dotted and T's that aren't crossed. Everything has been thoroughly looked over, thoroughly worked over, so that in that time, we remain stable, like it says in Isaiah 33:6. There's a beauty to the process, man. There's a beauty to the process. And in the line of work that I work in, it's a common saying to take pride in your work. To make things not only look good, but to make things function properly. You have to take pride and integrity in your work, which goes into us studying. Like it says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, it says, study to shew thyself approved unto the Heavenly Father, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. All right. When you get into that word study in the blue letter, it's Strong's G 4704, and it says to make effort, to be prompt or earnest, to give diligence, to be diligent, to endeavor, to labor. All right, and the scriptures tell us to hate not laborers' work. All right, this is Sirach or Ecclesiasticus. Let me see. Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, chapter 7 and verse 15. It says, hate not laborers' work, neither husbandry, which the Most High have ordained. All right, we're not supposed to hate laborers' work. There's a beauty in labor. There's a beauty in laborers' work, because the outcome is always more beautiful than the start. It's just like a garden, like husbandry. When you do a thorough work at the beginning of the process, the fruit thereof is even more beautiful than the start. It's even more bountiful than the start. But if you take shortcuts in husbandry, the crop that you yield at the end is always going to be unfruitful. It's always going to be less than desired. It's always going to be lacking if you take a shortcut at the beginning of your your husbandry. Husbandry is a very laborious, tedious work. It takes attention to detail. It takes labor. It takes blood, sweat, tears, hard times. It takes perseverance, all the which the Lord is looking for within his elect. All right, concerning this work and concerning the building of this third temple, which is spiritual, within his men, first and foremost. And I had this on ChatGPT, I typed in, what does it mean to be thorough? It says to be thorough means to do something carefully, completely, and with attention to all important details, rather than rushing or overlooking things. All right, I'm gonna read that again. All right, because it says to be thorough means to do something carefully. All right, and the Lord told us to take care of our work. All right, otherwise, it'll be given to those who do care for it. Let me get this. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 21. 20, it says, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called, being a servant? Care not for it. If thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also he that is called, being free, is a Mashiach's servant. Ye are bought with a price. Be ye not the servants of men. All right, so it says, art thou called to be a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. All right, and we're supposed to use, all right, the service that we've been given, put in use the spirit that we've been given to do a thorough work. All right, we're supposed to take care, of this work that's being performed, not only, within the world, but within ourselves, within the body, within the ministry. All right, we're supposed to take care of this work. All right, it's a labor. It's a part of being thorough. It says to do something carefully and completely. All right, the scriptures tell us to make full proof of our ministry. All right, the Apostle Paul said, to make full proof of our ministry. He told us to continue in the things of which we've been taught and assured of. He told us that there's a crown laid up for all those who finish their course. Lord willing, will the elect. There's a crown laid up for those who complete the work. We have to see this thing through to the end, man. We have to be thorough. It says, and with attention to all the important details. All right, and that goes into the study, acquainting ourselves with prophecy, with the dark sayings and parables contained within the Bible, so that we're adept to teach, we're adept to lead, all right, and to give spiritual advice, to be spiritual leaders, to be he-goats of the flock, and to be ultimately the Lord's servants. All right, we have to pay attention to all the important details, even when it comes to how the Lord is speaking within our lives personally. All right, that's a very thorough work in itself, paying attention to what the Lord is telling you every day and throughout your prospective situations that the Lord is taking you through. It says, rather than rushing or overlooking things, rather than taking a shortcut and rushing, just to appease the flesh for the moment. Like our elders and apostles tell us all the time, there is no shortcut to wisdom. There is no shortcut to experience. These are all things that are forged through time. These are all things that are forged through being thorough, paying attention to detail in your work, studying, being a part of the ministry, a productive member of the body, fellowshipping, camping, making videos, listening to videos. All right, it's all a process that you have to learn to fall in love with. And once you fall in love with the process, all right, you begin to see and grow on another level. That thoroughness increases and it translates to the next man. It's a very beautiful work that the Lord has going on, man. I just want to bring this quick, impromptu lesson, something I was meditating on earlier today. Lord, when this is edifying to you elect, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahushai, Bahashum, Ruach HaKodesh. And double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well. And grace and peace to you, elect around the four winds, believing and pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. May Shalom. Stop looking for shortcuts.